I blacked out and woke up in my boss's bed. He got his revenge a day later. Is it self-sabotage to know that what you are doing is wrong and yet stay on that path? Well, that is precisely what happened to me. And I honestly do not know if self-sabotage is the word I would use to describe what happened to me, but it is really close. My husband James used to say that I was the apple of his eye. That was his own way of saying that I was very special to him, and I knew that. I knew I was special to him, but it wasn't enough. I was always an ambitious person, and I expected that to take me places, because I believed that ambition rules the world, not talent. But the places ambition took me to were darker than the very depth of a black hole. It took me to places that made me lesser and unworthy to be the apple of my husband's eye. It all began to fall apart when my boss announced that he was being transferred to another subsidiary. And with that, his position was left open for someone within the subsidiary I was working in. It was the best news ever. Normally, when transfers like this happen, the company brings somebody from outside to take the open position. But excitingly, that did not happen this time. They wanted somebody amongst us to become the new boss, and I would not let that opportunity pass by me. The first person I told about this development was my husband. You should have seen the way I burst into the house that evening after work. He had to place his hands on my shoulders and ask me to take a deep breath before I spoke. But that was very difficult because I was so excited. I still kept trying to talk, and I was only able to keep quiet after he covered my lips with his palm. We stayed that way for a few seconds before he then let go of my lips and told me to talk. I took a deep breath and then told him about the promotion that was coming up, and he was just as excited for me. He was so interested in what it would take for me to be considered for the promotion and was willing to help me with anything as I needed. I told him that I would have to work more hours, especially late hours. I also told him that I wouldn't really be available at home as I used to be, at least for the meantime. He looked at me for a few seconds and asked me to give him a time frame. I didn't understand what he meant by that, and when I asked for clarification, he told me that he didn't want something indefinite, so I should give him a timeline of how long I would need to put in all this extra work on time into my job. My boss was leaving our subsidiary at the end of the month, and a new head would need to be appointed either before he left or immediately after. That gave me between 3 and 4 weeks to clinch that promotion. So I looked my husband in his eyes and told him that I needed a month, just 1 month. He smiled at me and caressed my chin, then said to me that I shouldn't worry about the house for the next 1 month. He said that he got it all covered. I was so happy that I got married to somebody I could rely on, especially in times like this. James and I had been married for almost 6 years, and we had a beautiful son as evidence of our love. I knew that for the next month, I wouldn't be able to see my son as much because I would have to leave the house very early and come back very late. And as much as it hurt me, I was doing this for my family, or at least that's what I told myself. But do you know the funny thing about life? While you are busy making other plans, life is taking decisions for you. I had no idea that my boss was planning to use the little time he had left in the company to drive up his performance numbers as the head of our subsidiary and increase his body count drastically. And what made it worse was that the powers that be gave him the authority to recommend who will take over from him. And it was definitely a fact that whoever he recommended would take over from him. I don't know if I was too naive or just ignorant to think that putting in the extra work and extra time and maybe a little bit of ass-kissing would set me up for the position. But that was what I expected. But more than that, I needed to stand out. So I needed to be really exceptional for the next month. I already had a good record in the company, but now I needed to be the absolute best so I would be considered for the role. And without even knowing, I began taking the motivational quotes my husband pasted around the living room a bit seriously. The one that really stuck with me was something about dressing and acting like the person you want to be. I took that one a little bit too seriously, and I don't mean that I just held it close to my heart, no. I actually spent quite a bit on new clothes because I wanted to look great. I even began talking and acting like I had achieved this position I was trying so hard to accomplish. But before I knew it, I began taking things too far. I worked my skin off the first week, and I was more than happy to do all that work because I had an end result in mind. I could already see myself in my boss's office, on his chair. I could already see myself as the new boss. But where things began to look dim was at the end of the first week. When I was closing from work late that Friday, my boss walked up to me. I didn't even see him approach me. I just heard his voice from behind me, and my heart nearly skipped out of my chest. I immediately turned to him and greeted him, and he told me to relax. I guess he could see how tensed up I was. I took a deep breath, and he told me that he needed some of us to come into work the next day. And mind you, the next day was a Saturday. I knew I would have to work extra hard for this promotion to work, but I didn't think I would have to work on a weekend as well. I nodded without even thinking much about it and told my boss that I would be at work the next day. He walked away, and I went back to doing what I was doing. I watched him from the side of my eye, and I saw him approach one of my colleagues and talk to her. I watched curiously, and from what I could see, he was asking her the same thing he asked me. He was asking her to come in for work on the weekend, and after that, he walked to another colleague. I watched carefully and noted every single person he approached. I drew this conclusion in my mind that everyone he was approaching was people he was considering for the promotion. I mean, it was common sense. I looked at the time, and it was way beyond closing hours. Work closed hours ago, and a lot of people had gone home. The few of us that were still there were putting in the extra work and time. I knew everyone there to be a shark, people who were hardworking and ambitious like me, and my boss just confirmed it with the way he walked around and asked almost all of them to come to work the next day. I now knew who the people I was competing against were. I was so obsessed with the promotion, and I was more preoccupied with seeing everyone that my boss was picking as competition, that I didn't take my time to note the difference between who he was picking and who he wasn't picking. I didn't notice it then, but he was only picking women to come to work the next day, and almost everyone he didn't ask to come work the next day was a man. The only other non-male staff he didn't pick were women who were old or even middle-aged. It's funny how I didn't notice any of this at that time. I was so blinded by ambition, but that was the reality I was facing. When I went home that day, my husband told me that he had a meeting that Saturday, so he would need me to keep an eye on our son for the day. I was worried. I didn't know how to tell him that I had been asked to come to work the next day. I don't know why I didn't say anything. I just agreed, even though I knew I wasn't going to be home that Saturday. Early that morning, my husband got dressed and left the house. He was particularly edgy that day. I could tell that the meeting was a very important one, but I knew asking him about it would only make me feel more guilty. So I said nothing to him. I even pretended to be still asleep when he left. Once I heard his car drive off, I sprang out of bed and called my cousin. I asked her to help me watch my son that Saturday. I didn't expect to work for too long that day, given it was a weekend. I thought I would be back from work by noon or before 2 o'clock in the afternoon. My cousin was sort of unhappy because she had plans that weekend, but she knew I needed her help, so she came through for me. I hurried and got ready for work, but my cousin was taking too long to get to the house. Yeah, I did exactly what you are thinking. I left my son alone in the house. Although I first gave him cereal and put on his favorite show on the television. I told him that my cousin was coming to take care of him, but I needed to work. He didn't cry or even mind, at least not when I was leaving. He was so preoccupied with his cereal and his show that he didn't worry about me leaving him alone in the house. When I got to work, there were already about 3 of us there. I greeted them and went to my desk. My boss wasn't even at work yet, and I was thankful that I got there before him. I didn't want to look like the one that wasn't serious. My boss came to work about 20 minutes after I arrived, and he was more than delighted to see all of us present. We were now complete, and there was something he said that should have given me a heads up of what was going on. He said that this was how the office was supposed to be, filled with beautiful people. He didn't say anything about us being hardworking, smart, or even ambitious. He said beautiful, but I was too stupid or too ignorant to even care. As we were working at our desks, he called one of us to his office. I don't know why he called her, but it made me worry. I asked myself why he didn't call me. What could that girl help him with that I couldn't? I was really worried and curious, and it made me unable to focus on work. I was distracted for the 30 or so minutes that she was in his office, and when she came out, she had this proud grin on her face. It made me quake within myself. It wasn't possible for him to have picked his preferred replacement already. After all, it was just the first week. He He wasn't leaving until the end of the month. He couldn't have made his decision already. That is what I kept telling myself. But still, I couldn't get that smirk off my mind. While I was worried about that, I was also worried about my husband coming home to find out that I went to work. I needed to get back home before I got home. I had gotten a few calls from my cousin, all of which I didn't answer because I didn't want to look unserious. So when it was a few minutes past 2:00, I went to my boss's office and asked him when we were closing that day. He outright told me that we could leave whenever we wanted, but he added that all of us in the office that day knew exactly what we were there for. He said that we knew exactly what we wanted, and that we were there by choice, but we were free to leave whenever. I knew that was his way of saying that if I wanted the promotion bad enough, I wouldn't mind working all day. I knew leaving would most likely push me off his top choice list for the promotion, so I simply nodded and went back to my desk, where I continued work. I kept looking at the time as I was working. It soon got to 6 p.m. My cousin had called me at least 20 times that day, and after 6, my husband began calling me as well. I ignored all their calls and even made sure my phone didn't ring out. I was going to get that promotion by any means necessary. My boss only came out of his office by 7 p.m. and told us that we could go home. But then he asked the girl who went to his office earlier to stay back. He said he wanted to discuss something with her. I was even more worried when this happened, but I needed to get back home. So I packed my things and bolted up the house as quickly as I could. On getting home, I saw my husband waiting in front of the house. He looked restless and impatient. He was tapping his feet on the floor like he was holding the fury of hell in his chest. When he saw me, his eyes widened. He tried to talk, but I spoke first. I tried to calm him down by saying that I knew he was angry, but I needed him to calm down and hear me out. The first thing he said was that he was indeed angry, but anger wasn't the dominant emotion he was feeling. He said that he was more disappointed than angry. He was disappointed in me. That stung. I couldn't believe it. My husband had never used those words on me before, and when I heard them, they echoed the gravity of what I had done. But I still didn't even realize how much trouble I had caused until I went into the house. I saw my son sleeping on my cousin's lap in the living room, and he had a bandage around his finger. And I hurried to him. My cousin strictly whispered that I should not wake him up. She was so angry, perhaps even angrier than my husband. I asked her what happened, and just then my husband came in. He clearly didn't want to exchange words with me, so he avoided me like the plague. He took our son from my cousin and carried him into his room. I then asked my cousin again what had happened, and my goodness, the way she looked at me, it was chilling. She told me that all I had to do was wait for about 20 or 30 minutes. That was all I had to do, but I was so impatient that I stormed off to work, leaving my son alone. After I left my son in the house that morning, he tried cutting an apple, but he cut his finger in the process. My cousin came home to see him crying and bleeding. She tried calling me several times, but I didn't pick up any of her calls. She shook her head and told me that whatever I was hoping to achieve at work better be worth all of these problems. After that, she left the house. I took a seat and buried my face in my palms. I knew things were going the wrong way, and they were going that way because of me. But I had a goal and needed to achieve it. I reminded myself that certain sacrifices had to be made for the greater good. I kept taking motivational quotes and bending their true meaning to accommodate my excesses. My husband came out of our son's room a few minutes after my cousin had left. He met me in the living room, and I immediately stood up, hoping to talk to him, but all he said was good night. It was just a few minutes past 8:00, and everyone was going to bed already. I felt like the villain in the story. The next morning, being a Sunday, the only person happy to see or talk to me in the house was my son. He told me about his injury, and I kissed his finger, telling him that he would be fine. On Monday morning, I went to work, and things just got even weirder from there. The boss was giving a lot of work to everyone, and over the course of the week, he called a different woman into his office every day, women from the Saturday work team. At some point, I was beginning to wonder if he was holding some sort of interview for all of them without letting us know. I kept asking myself why I wasn't being called to his office like the rest. It made me worried, and I kept wondering when he would call me. On Friday evening, he asked the same set that worked the previous Saturday to come to work again the next Saturday. I did not know how I wanted to tell my husband that I wouldn't be available that Saturday as well, but I figured it would be better to be honest with him than to trying to cut corners like I did the previous weekend. So when I went home, I told my husband that I wasn't going to be home that Saturday. He was very unhappy about it, but he managed to keep his cool and acted nonchalant. He told me that I could do whatever I wanted. He said I was the owner of my life. I didn't like his response, so I asked him what he meant by that. We had a bit of an argument, although I was mostly the one hurling the harsh words. He didn't seem to care much about arguing or making a point. Well, at least until I accused him of being unreasonable. I told him that he knew the plan, and that I told him about how tasking the promotion phase would be. I reminded him that he promised me 1 month. He said he knew that weekdays were going to be very tasking and overwhelming, and he anticipated that. But he didn't think I wouldn't be home on weekends as well. He said that I never said anything about weekends. I told him that I didn't know I would have to work on weekends as well. He said he didn't want to argue with me anymore, so he just walked into the room. I didn't like the feeling of leaving the house after we had such a heated argument. We were the couple that sorted everything out on the spot, but I guess he didn't see the need to sort this particular issue, because I would still do what I wanted to do. I got to work and my boss was already there. He told me that I was slipping. I was already upset from the argument with my husband, and hearing my boss say that just invigorated me the most. I wanted to snap at him, but I apologized and went to my desk. I worked till it was late. That day, he didn't call any of the women until we had closed. Then he asked one of us to stay behind. I was curious, so I approached the girl he asked to stay back the previous weekend. As we walked out of the company building, I asked her what the boss wanted to talk to her about. She looked at me with suspicious eyes, and I could already see all the walls going up. She shut me out entirely, refusing to tell me anything. When I tried pushing even further, she practically ran away from me. I wondered if that was how competitive everyone was being. I approached the others who were called into his office throughout the well, and no one wanted to talk about their conversation with the boss. I found that really disturbing. I went home that night and my husband had made dinner. After we ate, he took me outside to the porch and told me he didn't like how we were arguing so much. I said I didn't like it as well. He apologized for being inconsiderate. He said he knew that the 1 month I asked for was going to be tasking, but he just didn't expect that I would work on Saturdays. He then told me that I didn't have to worry about anything, that I could work on Saturdays. He told me he understood that I was pursuing a goal and that he wasn't going to stand in the way. He reminded me that when one of us wins, it is a win for the whole family. I appreciated his understanding. I didn't like the feeling that I was the one causing a strain in my family, and with the discussion we had that night, that feeling melted away. Halfway through that week, my boss called me into his office. I felt a rush of anxiety and joy when he called me. It was finally my turn. I looked at some of the women I had approached to ask what they discussed with the boss, and I smiled at each and every one of them that I looked at. In my mind, my time had come, and perhaps they had all flopped in the interviews, but I wasn't going to flop in mine. When I got into the office, I closed the door and took a seat. My boss asked me if I knew why he called me. I liked being the staff that takes initiative, so I told him exactly what I thought. I told him that he wanted to interview me for the promotion. He chuckled and said that it wasn't exactly an interview, but it was somewhat similar. This made me even more curious. I was at the edge of my seat. A billion questions ran through my mind. I wondered which one he was going to ask. While I was still thinking, he asked me what I was willing to do to secure the promotion. That wasn't a question I needed to think about. I told him that I would do absolutely anything to get promoted. He smiled and said that he knew that I was someone he could trust. With that feedback from him, I knew that I was a shoo-in. I just needed to answer the questions correctly and maintain a good composure. He suddenly got up from his chair and walked around the desk. As he did so, he asked me when the last time I was intimate. I was taken aback by that question. I didn't see how that was appropriate for an interview, and I said that to him. He chuckled and stood behind me. He told me that I was a feisty one. He placed his hands on my shoulders and told me that he determines what is appropriate and what isn't. I felt cold and scared when I felt his frosty fingers land on my shoulders. He told me that he knew that I had been going around asking the other women what they had been coming to do in his office. His hand slowly reached down from my chest, and I immediately got up. I asked him what he was trying to do, and instead of giving me a direct answer, he told me that he was giving each and every one of us a chance to impress him, and so far, none of us were really impressing him. That was when everything became clear to me. They were all sleeping with him. I told him that I was a married woman, and his answer was that me being married made it even more interesting. I couldn't believe this man. I mean, you think you know someone until they show a side of themselves you have never seen before. I got up and told him that I couldn't do what he wanted me to do. I wanted to walk out of the office, and he told me that if I walked out of the office, then I should kiss my hopes of getting the promotion goodbye. I didn't look back. I kept my head straight and headed out of the office. When I got to my desk, I was so worried that I might lose my job. The women who had gone up to his office in the past 2 weeks were now looking at me, some with a smile, some with a surprised look, and others with a worried look. I wished I could go into their minds and see what they were thinking, but I couldn't. I was out of his office the fastest out of all of them, so I presumed I was the only one that didn't give in. I was out of there in under 5 minutes. My heart was beating. I was worried. All my hopes of a promotion had all gone up in smoke. While I was still there thinking, I heard my boss's voice. He called another girl up to the office. I couldn't believe what this man was doing in broad daylight. That day, I didn't see the need to stay at work until late. Like he said, my hopes of getting a promotion were as good as dead the minute I walked out of his office. So I left at the official closing hours of work. But instead of going home, I went to a bar. I took a table all by myself and was slowly drinking and thinking about how all my hard work had been rendered pointless. While I was still in thought, someone joined me at my table. Without even looking at the person's face, I said that I just wanted to be alone, so the person should find another table. The person chuckled and said, "That's not a very nice way to talk to your boss." I looked at him, and it was indeed my boss. I was so startled. I asked what he was doing there, and he told me that he wanted to talk to me. That made me even more worried. He confirmed my suspicion by saying that I was the only woman who had turned him down in the office, and that in doing so, I had made him even more interested in me. My eyes opened wide when he said this. He told me that he was going to give me one more chance to make things right. He said that he was going to give me a chance to sleep with him and have a shot at the promotion. I gulped down my drink and told him that I couldn't. Then I walked away. I went home and got a hug from both my son and husband. They were happy that I was home early that day. My husband asked me if everything was all right. I looked straight in his eyes, and I had the right option of telling him the truth, but I didn't. I smiled and told him that everything was fine. I told him my boss didn't need us to work the extra hours that day. He didn't mind. He was just happy to see me. He made a joke about how my boss must have seen how hard I was working, and that was why he decided to send us home at the appropriate time that day. My husband believed so deeply that I was going to get that promotion. In his mind, no one deserved it better than me. I didn't know how to tell him that I was no longer in the race for the promotion anymore. For the rest of the week, my boss kept looking at me with this mischievous and wanting stare. It was like I was some sort of prey, and he was a predator who enjoyed hunting. On Friday, when work was closing, he called me to his office. This time he told me that he still hadn't been able to move on from me. He said that his mind was stuck on me. He said that he would give me anything I wanted, and even more if only I would be intimate with him. I won't lie. The offer sounded very interesting, but I couldn't, and I told him I couldn't. As I was about to walk away, my boss held my hand and told me that he was holding a going-away party the next day, which was Saturday. Sure, he still had about a week left before he officially left, but he wanted to celebrate with everyone. He asked me to come. I just gave a fake smile and left the office. When I got home, I kept thinking about whether or not I should go to the party. I was playing out so many scenarios in my head. I thought about how things were now in my favor. Yes, I was being delusional. I told myself that my boss was now attracted to me and was almost obsessed with me, so I had a bigger chance of actually getting the promotion. All I needed to do was play along, and I would be sure to get what I had worked so hard for. I told my husband about the party. My workplace had had parties in the past, so nothing would make this one stand out. Or at least that was what I thought. But it did stand out to my husband because the party was in my boss's house. That Saturday, I was at home, and my family was so happy to have me with them on a weekend again. The party was to start in the early hours of the evening. It would only be for a few hours, and everyone would head home before it was too late in the night. But on getting there that evening, I just knew the party wasn't going to end early. There was a lot of alcohol. I just told myself that I would flirt with my boss a little bit, then I would head home. My boss was surrounded by some girls when I went to him. I didn't say a word. I just walked away, and he immediately followed me. He took me to his table, where we talked and drank. He tried touching me, but I refused. Although as the night went deeper and the effects of the alcohol got stronger, he soon started having his way. He caressed my thighs and my arms, and by the time I couldn't tell what the time was, his hands were all over me. I don't know how I let myself get so drunk. Perhaps it was my way of loosening up, or maybe I just didn't want to feel how my boss was touching me. I know I keep making excuses for my actions, but I knew I needed to make tough decisions if I wanted to get that promotion. Fortune favors the bold, as they say, but I think I took things too far, and before I knew it, I blacked out. I woke up when I heard someone calling my name so loudly. My head was banging, and the sound of my name hurt really badly. I opened my eyes and saw myself lying next to my boss on his bed. I can't remember which of these two thoughts came into my mind first, the realization of what had happened, or the curious wonder of who was calling my name. But that question was soon answered when I heard my name one last time from outside the room, just before the door was pushed open and my husband walked in. I was too startled to move, and he was too shocked to say anything. I tried getting up, only to show my nudity even further. I was ashamed, and I hid underneath the blanket there. My husband didn't even say anything. He just turned around and walked away. I quickly put on a shirt and hurried after him, but by the time I got outside, he had driven away. I quickly made my way home, but when I got there was no one at home. It was a Sunday, and not even my son was home. I was about to leave when I saw my cousin around the house. She asked me what I had done, and I answered by asking her if she knew where my husband and son were. She said my husband called her this morning to come look after our son, while he looked for me. He came back some minutes prior, took the boy, and left. She then asked me again what I had done. I had no words. I kept trying to find my husband and our son that whole day, but I couldn't. I wanted to apologize and tell him it was a mistake, but I couldn't. I called his parents. They just lived outside the city. I didn't want to worry them, so I just asked when they last talked to my husband. They said it was a few days ago. I left to go see my cousin and ask her if she had any clue as to where they would have gone. That was fruitless as well. When I got back at the end of the day, I saw my husband's car in the driveway. I rushed inside but didn't see my husband. Then I went to the back, and I saw him burning the new clothes I got that month in hopes of being promoted. But that wasn't all. He was burning pictures of us together. I screamed and ran at him, but it was too late. They were all turning to ash really quickly. He told me that he had tolerated a lot, but he would never tolerate cheating. He said we were over and that I would never see my son again. I fell on my knees, cried, and begged him, but he refused to listen to me. He walked away, telling me that he was selling the house, so I better figure out where I want to live. Update. It's been a few months since James caught me cheating, and I feel like I should let you guys in on what has happened with my life since then. Well, my husband did sell the house and refunded me what little I contributed to buying the house. We are officially divorced, and he has full custody. Here's the ironic thing. My boss actually gave me the promotion. But after being the boss for a week, I resigned. Everything was overwhelming, and everyone had heard of how I slept with my boss to get the position, so I couldn't face anyone at the company with a straight face. I moved to another city to get a fresh start. I got an apartment, and I was able to get a job, thankfully. My life is getting balanced again after some months, but I feel alone. I've been alienated by everyone, and life doesn't feel worth it anymore. I just wish I could have my husband back, my family back. I miss them so much.